Hello everyone, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar on scenarios and foresight analysis, two very important innovation intelligence tools. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Ted Farrington as a Musser visiting scholar to talk to you today. My name is Carrie Slade, and I'm the Assistant Academic Director of Temple's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Institute. This program is part of Temple's ongoing commitment to innovation management and entrepreneurship. If you're interested in learning more, we offer a Master's of Science degree in Innovation Management and Entrepreneurship, as well as some certificate programs and some concentrations through the MBA program. A brief introduction on Dr. Farrington. He has a master's degree and PhD in chemical engineering, and he's worked for many years in the pharmaceutical industry, including for companies like Johnson & Johnson. He also served as a senior director for advanced research for PepsiCo, and most recently was a scenario and foresight analysis consultant with Calypso Consulting. I'll turn it over to Dr. Farrington in a second. There will be time at the end for questions, but if you have questions, feel free to message them to me. Again, my name is Carrie Slade, and I'll consolidate them and can pass them along to him, and I'll also be taking questions from the audience a little bit later. All right, Dr. Farrington.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Slade. This is Ted Farrington. It's really an honor for me to be here today giving this presentation as the Musser Visiting Scholar. And I especially am happy to be talking about a topic I have great passion for that I really became familiar with the last 10 years of my 35-year-plus career in R&D in different companies. I want to talk today about using scenarios to explore the future in a structured way to help guide strategic planning of a company or portfolio management for an R&D organization or topics like that. So let's get started. First of all, a very important point before we go too far, strategic foresight or scenarios is not about predicting the future. They're two entirely different things. Strategic foresight or scenarios is about creating alternative, provocative, yet plausible views of the future that we explore and help us guide our organization as the true future unveils itself. If you're really lucky in portfolio management, you'll find there's some overlap of the futures, and some initiatives will do well in multiple futures. As someone who managed R&D portfolios for many years, to me this is the real power of scenario techniques. Corporate strategy also uses them. There are many other applications, but as an R&D person, it's advanced portfolio management. Here's our agenda for today, a brief introduction to scenarios. I'll talk about the two main types that are used, deductive and inductive. While describing deductive, we'll build a simple one while we're talking about it. And then I'll also demonstrate building an inductive scenario. And this part of the presentation is actually taken from a real piece of work, which was an 18-month project done for the Industrial Research Institute to explore the future of research and technology management 25 years out into the future. So it's a really nice piece of work, and I basically have trimmed down the final report for that project for this section. A little summary and some conclusions, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. I'll pause between some of the major sections and also send any questions you have to Dr. Slade, and she'll interrupt me. So here we go. First, scenarios. The best description is similar to what I said earlier. Internally consistent alternative views of the future that are provocative yet plausible and allow us to become better prepared as the real future unveils itself. They're not predictions or forecasts. Anyone who works in strategic foresight or is a futurist first says you cannot predict the future, but you can interrogate it in structured ways to be better prepared. So these explore alternative futures, and on a good project, 50% of the time is probably spent analyzing the futures to help guide the organization. So building the futures is just half of the job. A little history of scenarios. The person credited most often with creating the field was Herman Kahn, who used them in the government, in the military, as the beginning of war games back in the Cold War. When we in the Soviet Union were worried about launching against each other, how would these different scenarios play out? And that began the RAND Corporation. In the late 60s and early 70s, Royal Dutch Shell became the first company to make significant use of scenarios, and they did one of the most famous set of scenarios ever. Everyone knows there was a big oil crisis in 1974. A few of us actually were there for it, and it really disrupted gas supply and everything else. But in the late 60s, some Shell executives basically went to an offsite for a few days and thought about the future. In the late 60s, running an oil company was really easy. There's infinite supply of oil, 7% growth. So it's just planning when to build the next refinery and a few more ships. That's all that it was. Some folks at Shell asked the question, can that go on forever? And they built different scenarios of how things might go in the future. And they concluded that no matter what supply was available, eventually, at some point, the oil-producing companies would have to constrain supply. They did not predict when. They were just pretty convinced it would happen. But what they did, which any good scenario project does, is put in the effort to identify milestones that would be seen before it actually happened, to give them a heads up early. And before the oil crisis really happened, they saw it first, and they were the only company to stop building refineries and not go into an overcapacity situation. It actually moved them, I think, from number 8 to number 2 in global oil companies by the time they've done this, and another one in the 80s. So tremendous business impact. It's a famous set of scenarios. There's a book called The Art of the Long View by Peter Schwartz, all about what happened at that meeting. In the 80s, if you're a movie fan, the original War Games with Matthew Broderick, at the end, the Whopper computers analyzing rapidly all the different ways the U.S. and Soviet Union might battle to see if there's any way to win. So it was running military scenarios. Kind of a fun movie. In the 90s, there's a good example of using scenarios for other purposes. There are a famous set of scenarios called the Montfleur scenarios. In the 90s, when the Republic of South Africa decided to stop apartheid, they hired the Shell people to come down and build scenarios of their possible futures. And what you'll see as we go along, and if you do any of this work, futurists love naming their futures. So the futures from that nice piece of work were named after birds. There's the flight of the flamingos, the ostrich, and so on. But what the Republic of South Africa did with that was pick the future they would like to have and then reverse engineer the decisions they'd have to make to not go down the other path. So that was used to help guide their future. Today, you'll see scenarios all over. There's a whole society of people doing this. Shell still publishes scenarios every year. If you just Google the Shell scenarios. So a very active area. A number of companies run their entire enterprise off of scenarios now. So they go back quite a ways. The two main types we'll talk about today are the deductive versus the inductive scenario. The deductive scenario is driven by uncertainties. You think about trends and things you're seeing and identify things that are uncertain and important to your business. And for my example, the most common deductive is a 2x2 exercise. And I picked global economy as one uncertainty. That's across the x-axis. The minus is the economy goes down. The plus is the economy goes up. It's as easy as that. The other axis I picked just for this example is healthcare responsibility. Well, healthcare responsibility 10, 20 years from now will be more in the hands of the government or the individuals. And that simple matrix creates 4 combinations of those pluses and minuses. And when you're doing a deductive scenario, you go into each quadrant separately, independently, envision that future, and ask the question, what would we have to do well in that future? Find new products, survive as a company, whatever. The main feature of deductive scenarios is that the space of the scenarios is defined at the beginning by this matrix. Inductive scenarios are much harder to do. They're more complicated, they're messy, but they're a more realistic view of how the world really operates, where seemingly unrelated trends and events find some way to interact and create an unexpected future. They're challenging because you don't know the end when you start. They evolve and emerge from interactions among all the trends that you find, and you create a story along the way. So the space is defined as you go, not at the beginning, like a deductive. We'll do an example of each and actually go through the steps of building at least the deductive one in enough detail for someone to give it a try. So next, we'll build a deductive scenario. I'm going to pretend to be the head of R&D for a major automotive company. Okay, and there's a lot of trends and things going on in automotive. But the question as an R&D leader is, what would be the key areas of innovation for our industry over the next 20 years that should drive my R&D budget? How am I going to invest my R&D budget? So I'm going to build a quick deductive scenario to look into this. Step one of any good foresight project is have a clear question. Okay, you don't just talk about the future. Step two, this is several weeks of work, just this part in a real project, but collect all the trends you think might be driving change in the area of interest for the question. Also identify things that are more uncertainties. The price of oil, it might go up or down. You don't have to project it. It's an uncertainty. And then the first major step is to take all of those and plot them on this graph, which has certain to uncertain on the y-axis, low impact to high impact on the x-axis. For some who may be on the line, we had a 3-hour workshop last night and went through this and tried to quickly build some with some graduate students here, and it was a lot of fun. Anyway, there's not much point in paying attention to the low impact, but the highly uncertain, high impact areas are where you pick, the axes for that matrix. So for my example, I'm running R&D in my car company. I'm going to pick these two axes. On the x-axis, oil might be low or it might be high. Okay, those are the two extremes for plus and minus. The other dimension I picked was environmental concerns. The minus is most people are fairly unconcerned. They care, but they're not going to pay extra to help the environment. The plus is activist consumers. There's a really strong intent to actually do good for the environment. Well, that creates the 4 different quadrants. The upper right is you have high prices of oil and really strong consumers who want to help the environment. The bottom left is just the opposite. Most are unconcerned about the environment and oil's cheap. What you do in a deductive scenario where the real work comes in is a couple steps. One is you live in each of those futures. What will that future look like? What environment will my R&D organization be in? So don't overanalyze these. I made them up as an example. But if oil prices are high and everyone is really an environmental activist, Nikola Tesla wins. I mean, electric cars will dominate in that future. Okay. In the lower left, just the opposite happens. The price of oil is cheap. There's not much concern about the environment, or at least people don't want to spend to help it. And I titled that one, tomorrow looks a lot like today. Oil is not that expensive. There is concern about the environment, but I'd say most people still don't want to really pay for it. In that environment, gas is the internal combustion gas engine will continue to dominate. In the lower right, we have a case where the price of oil is high. It's high enough to have a financial incentive to help the environment. So the gasoline internal combustion engine would shrink and the others would grow some amount. The upper left, I'll switch when the cost comes down. There's no financial incentive to go there to electric cars because oil is so cheap. But I do want to help the environment, and when the cost of the electric or other kinds of cars comes down, I will go there. So those are the 4 different environments from this quick scenario. A real project is 3, 4, 5 months, and most of it is this slide and the next one. And you get full reports on what each of these means. But for our little example, I've created these 4 alternative futures. Now my question is how to invest my R&D dollar, or what projects would have value in these different futures. So a scenario project, once they found the future, will spend weeks or months analyzing it. What would be good projects in the different futures? For example, if Nikola Tesla is going to win, battery research and recharge infrastructure will be the focus of my research. If instead tomorrow is more like today, I still have an internal combustion engine style, but maybe there are different fuels, and certainly I want more efficient internal combustion engines. Okay, so the portfolio of projects is different depending on the future. But you do see one of the features I mentioned earlier, in that making cars lighter is good in all four futures. So it's a good project to have no matter which future plays out. It might be more important than one or another, but it's there for every single one. If you're managing R&D like I used to, this is a home run. And it's what I like to say is that scenario management for doing portfolios is advanced portfolio management, where you're picking initiatives, business models, and such, based on robustness across futures, not just a financial metric. Okay, so that's projects that would be good in the different quadrants. How do I bring that into my company? Many companies do great scenarios and then don't take the time to put a process behind them to run over the coming years. And this one, I've made this up, of course. Across the bottom is my R&D budget versus time. Good scenario projects invest the time, like Shell did, to think through the mileposts they would see along the way as the future goes forward. And as it goes forward, they adjust their agenda appropriately as the real future becomes more clear. So it's not a stagnant process. Okay, so that's a simple deductive scenario example. Here's the 7 steps we went through. Just about any book you find will teach some form of the same 7 steps with different specific tools for workshops and things like that. A couple of advanced topics. I mean, there's no reason to have just 2 levels. For the economy, often you see goes up, goes down, or stays the same. There's also no reason to have just 2 uncertainties. But if you have more than 2 uncertainties or more than 3 levels, you do not want to end up with more than 4 scenarios. So often scenarios done this way, you'll pick the 4 of interest. If you have 3 levels and 3 variables, that's 27 combinations. You don't want to do that. You just look through that matrix and pick 4 that sound really interesting. So they go beyond just the simple 2x2 model. So I've wrapped up that section. Are there any questions you want me to field, or I'll just move on?
If you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand. There should be a little button for you to raise your hand, and then I'll be able to see that and call on you. Charlotte Jacobs, let me find you and unmute you. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was just wondering, like, along the road, how vulnerable can you allow your scenarios to be? Like, of course, things change, and how often should you kind of like reconsider your scenario? Like, because everything that changed, of course, you cannot do this exercise over and over again.
Yeah, I could. One large company I know runs their entire enterprise off of scenarios, and it depends on the time frame of your company. The one I'm thinking of builds power systems, so they have about a 20-year time horizon, and they refresh their scenarios every 2 to 3 years. And that fits for most companies. There's no point in doing it 1 year later unless there's been some significant disruption. But every 2 to 3 years is what I usually see. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. All right. Let's move on.
Okay. For the second part, we'll talk about inductive scenarios. And here I'm going to give a brief version of a talk I actually gave at a conference a while back about the Industrial Research's IRI 2038 project. Back in 2013, actually, IRI, as part of its 75th anniversary, commissioned an 18-month-long futures project to ask the question, what might the world of R&D look like in 25 years? Therefore, the name IRI 2038. I had the honor and pleasure of doing that with a colleague of mine who's now at Calypso, and I'll go through this project. If you're not familiar with IRI, it's the Industrial Research Institute, although they recently rebranded themselves to the Industrial Research, what am I saying? Innovation Research Interchange. I've still not gotten used to the new name. But IRI was founded in 1938 when Procter & Gamble invited a number of R&D executives to their site in Ivorydale, and they talked in a non-competitive way about how to do R&D better. And now there are over 200 member companies. There are 2 or 3 annual meetings, many networks. They publish the Research and Technology Management Journal, and they continue to focus on, advancing the art and science of managing R&D. There are plenty of competitors in there. They just talk about how to do portfolio management, stage gate, and watch for new technology as an organization. So they commissioned a 25-year out futures project that I had the honor to lead along with Christian Cruz of Calypso. I'll talk about our approach, which is inductive scenarios, and show some of the results. There's much more to the project. There's actually a recording of the entire presentation out there on the internet that I could send folks, because it's really an hour-long talk, but we won't cover everything. To start, the future is a big place, and like the other example, you always have to pick some focus question. For IRI 2038, the question was, how might future trends, developments, and events impact the art and science of research and technology management over the next 25 years? We used a four-phase approach to doing the scenarios. This is one of the reasons I've done a lot of work with Christian and his team, because a lot of people can teach tools. He was the first one I saw that just could give you a true process from beginning to end, so you know what's coming. And we used a four-phased approach. In discovery, you look around today. You find out what the company believes about the future, your organization you're doing the work for through trends, and then you also look outside for things they haven't seen. Extrapolation sends those out into the future by a variety of different tools, because you need to build the future, a 25-year future, out of your projections that are out 25 years, not what you see today. Integration is pulling them together into the scenarios, and then planning is bringing them back to help the organization. Many great pieces of scenario work have ended up as nothing more than books on a shelf, because the company didn't have a formal process to bring them back into their planning process. The next slide, anticipate. If you talk to Christian today, what we do at Calypso, we talk more about a 3-phase step with anticipate in the middle, and it's just combined the 2 middle ones to make it a little simpler. Personally, I still like the four-phase one because it has a little more detail. Here are the exact tools we use for the project. In discovery, we always start with an internal futures audit, and that seeks to understand the official future that the organization you're dealing with has. It may not be written down, but if they're making decisions about the future, there is some assumptions they're making about the future. And we usually do that through interviews and find out what the company believes about the future. Environmental scanning, we look all around the world for trends that are off the radar of the company, or things that are so new and emerging we don't know if they're really going to take off or not. And futurists call those weak signals. Next, in extrapolation, we used implications wheels, which are a qualitative way to project out in the future. In other projects, we have used true forecasting methods in this one part of the project, because you do want to have an idea of where a specific topic might be 10 years out. We did just implications wheels this time. In integration, we built inductive scenarios. Then we did in-casting workshops. And this is where you make people live in that future for a day. What's it going to be like in that future is called an in-casting workshop. We actually did a global online game that I won't have time to talk about today, but I will give examples of the wrap-up was done with backcasting workshops. If you put yourself in a future of R&D management and you know what you have to do to be successful, what should you be doing today to get to that point 25 years from now? So my talk basically has one slide and some videos for each of these steps. So this was a big project. IRI has lots of members all over the world. And I had the honor and privilege of interviewing CTOs and vice presidents of all these different companies from all these different industries around the world. I interviewed the chairman of the Technology Council for LG in his office in Seoul because I happened to be in town one time. We did go across different channels, and we did interview people outside IRI because we didn't want to just be talking to ourselves. Okay, this shows some of the things we heard about. Okay, one of the biggest ones was they all felt that the reasons for working for a big company are going down every day, and so they just see a more open workforce in the future, and that's a big driver of some of the things in here. So there's virtual work and so on. Simulation plays a big role, and all of these came up at different levels during those interviews. In a project, a scenario project is all about diverging and converging. At one point, you might have 400 trends or signals where you can't bring them all forward. So you make some choices based on what everyone is really interested in. So we chose to bring these 5, I think it is, or 10 forward. Biotech and nanotech, robotics, simulation, sustainability, raw material shortages, especially rare earths and things, how we're going to be connected and working in the future. There's a lot of concern about the future of patents. Will they be enforced? Will we even have patents 25 years from now? How do you compete if you don't have patents? Global war for talent. I think some of these will pop up. No, that's it. No, I'm sorry. Global war for talent. There'll be a different way of looking at the value chain and open innovation. Not just innovating in R&D, but up and down the whole chain. And my comment earlier about a freelance workforce, it was a big driver in the scenarios. So these should not be a surprise to anyone. These were things we heard talking to the companies in the audit. Next, we did the weak signals, got hundreds of them, and picked the ones that I show here. And I'll just highlight a few that are interesting. They're all interesting, but a lot about the era of women. So this was 2012. We were doing this work for a project to end in 2013. And this is about how to manage R&D. And 25 years from now, there'll be many more women in senior positions in R&D in companies than there are today. And how will their presence have changed the way we manage R&D? It will have some different characteristics. Next, will we be actually crowdsourcing our R&D? Great way to find out if anybody wants some is ask them to chip in. The end of patents, folks are worried about that. The withering of the state, with the increasing power of the megacities. And what's the role of the traditional country state when Shanghai can basically define their own infrastructure and city? New corporate entities, companies that not only want to have a decent bottom line, but they want to do good for the environment, something good for the world. So they get reputations for different reasons. Human augmentation, both physical and mental, is a big topic because it's already starting and it scares the pants off of people in human resources. And I think it upset some of our folks because envision looking at at resumes where half the people are taking something to enhance the capability you're after, which is already happening, actually. Total simulation, we'll be able to simulate the answers to most technical questions by then, and maybe most of the human brain. Many feel that the greatest source of young educated talent by 25 years from now will be in Africa, because you can get educated anywhere in the world by then. It's fun doing a talk about a project you did several years back because you can see the things you got right and the things you kind of missed. But this one is about hacking becoming so big a problem that people actually remove themselves from the internet, and so do companies. So those are the weak signals, some of the weak signals we brought into this. Those are all seen today. You find them by looking around, and there are companies that do just that for a living. We move on to implications wheels, or implications trees, either way. And this is a qualitative way to project into the future and explore what might happen. So the one I picked was augmented workforce. We did this for all the trends and weak signals you just saw. So in implications trees or implications wheels, you suspend any debate of whether you think it's going to happen. Assume it's happened and say, what are the impacts? And for example, there's one tree down this, a branch that goes, well, you have a greater mental augmentation divide leading for a need for laws to protect the rights of the unaugmented? Or would it be used to level the playing field? You really don't know. Okay? They're not predictions. You're exploring alternatives that might happen. And you do this for all of your weak signals in this project. Another project I had, we had experts come in and talk about some of them. But when you're all done, you have maybe 10 of these from each of those 50 or so signals and trends. And it's the second and primarily third order impacts that become the building blocks for the houses you build during the scenario section, okay? So at this point, you have hundreds of these bricks to build your house from the outward impacts from the trends. It's a fun exercise to do on its own. As an R&D leader, I always wanted to have a culture where anyone who reads an obscure article that could be important if it came true could call a flash implications wheel session over lunch, because it really gets you out of your day-to-day to think of how an unusual thing might play out. So implications wheels. Now where the really hard work gets done is building the inductive scenarios, and there's 2 or 3 ways to do them. I showed one last night that's actually pretty difficult. It was one of the first ones we did. I hope some people from last night are on, because I'm showing a simpler way to do it today. But in inductive scenarios, what we did for this project, which played out over 18 months, was use workshops with participants from IRI for the different pieces of work. So we created what are called influence diagrams at their fall or their winter meeting, I guess, in Fort Lauderdale that year. And literally, we had 4 big tables with people around them, and what they were given were cards. And I think they got a total of 50 cards. And about 40 of them were common. They're all from those third order impacts. And then we seeded each table with several that were different. If you know the organization has an interest in how Africa is going to go, you'd seed it with things that steer you towards talking about Africa. For example, this one is more driven, I believe, by the freelance community. And then what we have them do is look for ones that interact with each other. Okay? If you see one, if one of these happened, it may make another one happen more or less. It's not meant to be causal, but there's some kind of interaction between them. And what you end up about it's about a full day exercise with 4 groups, and we left that one with 4 influence diagrams, we call them. They're not scenarios yet, but you've looked at all the cards, and there's one there called local manufacturing, and you see a lot of arrows in and out of that one. Okay, so we did that through a workshop. The consulting, I would not attempt these on your own unless you have professionals in your company. The consultants earn their keep by taking that mess and turning it into this. So that one happened to be called the death of distance versus the megacities. On the top of that line, the megacities have so much power, they're trying to control everything in their city. Below it are global forces against that. You're able to become educated anywhere on the planet. And citizens will fight back against some of the security measures. There's a whole write-up about that scenario, and there is a short video for each scenario. And if I can master the technology here, I'm going to play each of the videos, which are only like 1 minute long. So that was the megacities. Here we go. Okay, so that was the first. There are four. I'm going to go back and talk about the second one. Let's see. I'm sharing my screen. So the second scenario, whoops, became Africa leapfrogs developed countries. What you have above the dotted line are the struggles with established developed countries trying to launch new and innovative products because of their old infrastructure. And Africa is actually seen as having an advantage, just like they leaped ahead in bank systems and two cell phones because of lack of previous infrastructure. They're seen as being leaders in R&D and technology development in the future. Let me try. We're doing well here. Switch to my video. And Africa leapfrogs. Okay, so that's Africa leapfrogs. Let's go back to number 3. The third scenario. There we go. Is 3 roads to innovation. It's probably the one that's generated the most interest because it talks about how corporate R&D will be functioning. But in this one, the upper left uh, folks are extreme technology embracers. They almost hook their brains together to innovate fast. The lower left are retreaters. They form small groups of their own to promote R&D, and you can find these in the world already. Cities devoted to kinds of R&D or regions. Corporate R&D was where we created, well, I think it was mentioned one other time before us, but the Hollywood model, where the current R&D director becomes more like a movie director using temporary resources to do every project. So let's take a look at the movie for this one. There we go. Okay, let's see here. Get back to my screen. So those were the 4 scenarios that we created as from the 2038 project. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more. Well, that was 3. One more to go. This one is everything's in beta, and the premise of this is it's able to get consumer insight so fast, and feedback so fast. It's easier to launch a lot of projects and just adjust afterward than to run the big project for 3 years and launch what you know is perfect. The team felt that this would allow a company to free up resources to work on the big projects that are important to the planet. My own personal experience is every time I've saved any money, my company in R&D, my finance person took it before I did anything else with it. But that's a different story. I think for time's sake, I'm going to skip this video because it's a little late. I'll go on to the. So we have all the scenarios. There's 4 videos which can be found. They're out on the internet. Then we ran in-casting workshops. Those are great scenarios, well written up, videos so people can understand them. But you have to go inside them and live to see how it would impact R&D. So we decided to look at them through different lenses. If you're in each of the scenarios, how would you manage projects? How would you do portfolio management? What would R&D's value proposition to the enterprise be? And talent management. How would managing people be different in each of the 4? So we looked across them with those 4 lenses, which R&D people will still be doing 25 years from now, just with very different tools. So for example, from Africa leapfrogs, we see project management more fail-safe and fail-cheap than we even have today. There'll be software for project management more than today, more simulation. Value added would be all about speed because there's no long-term IP around, and it's a rented workforce. So talent sourcing becomes a big competitive advantage. For the second one, you see some slightly different effects. Since this one is the death of the distance versus mega cities, many smaller projects driven by city needs. Mega city pass, the projects will be judged on how they serve the city. And then a reputation market. And compensation may include city perks. 3 roads to innovation. It's all about collaboration because everybody's outside in the Hollywood model. So you're managing projects is all about collaboration, and simulation will improve project management. You'll run a very broad mix of very open to closed projects with unique needs, and your value will be connecting needs with the right research model and finding the resources. A strategic strength would be cultivating these teams, having the right reputation, and you'll even use simulation to assist team assembly. Everything's in beta, where things are just launched so fast, you just bring them back and fix. So very iterative product development. More AI for project management. Project portfolio management will be done by beta testing. Things will be out so fast, you'll have data right away. Value added will be as a problem solver, and a very bifurcated skills base, some that will be very mobile and some not. So those are some of the things we thought would impact the management of R&D in those 4 scenarios. And there are others. Just a quick summary. There were a few that came up across all the scenarios. Every single one of them, for one reason or another, saw a different role for IP or the classic patent. It could be because projects are on the shelves for shorter times. What's the point of a 20-year patent? Or the systems just collapsed. We see AI playing a much bigger role in project management because most results can be simulated. So the role of the project manager will be really interesting in that future. And finally, what we call extreme open innovation, where we will be forming agreements and partnerships that are much more complicated than the ones today. Most big companies are not very good at open innovation. They're not really skilled at working with small companies, so there's a lot to be done there. So that's what we got from the scenarios and the incasting. I got a couple slides on the backcasting, and then we'll wrap up. So backcasting is where you've envisioned a future, and you've figured out what you need to do to be successful in it 20 years from now. What should you see at 20, 15, 10, and 5 along the way? Backcasting cannot tell you what you should do on Monday. But it will tell you if you should start investing some of your research into things over the next few years to be prepared. One of the favorite examples I use is this one. I apologize that the time runs the other direction on this slide, but it's 25 years out and intellectual property is gone. You know, in this industry that counts on IP more than almost anyone else is pharmaceuticals to recoup their development costs. Well, how could you be successful then? Well, by 25 years, maybe you could have the FDA accept simulated clinical results. If you think about that and march forward, you can backcast things you better be starting today and what you better have accomplished along the way. So that's how you bring the further out results into some actionable strategies for today. The one on what's much more open innovation, you need to be a world-class innovation partner. There's some simple things and some harder ones to become that. You know, do companies recognize small business entities well? Most don't. They still want to own everything, and that's not going to fly. You know, but you can build a path to this and all of the other key features of being successful in the future. This is one I'll just flip through, that you want to end up with a reliable market for freelance talent, and we concluded what we needed was Angie's list for talent. Some trusted list of people and the skills they bring and how they've been rated, since they'll all be outside your company. So that's the end of that. That's a huge project to summarize in 30 minutes. The full talk is out on the internet. The project actually lives on. Every year since then, they've done a more in-depth study of part of that project, and now they've engaged Research Triangle Institute to do a set of scenarios every single year. So it's had a great impact across all the membership and IRI. There's a book on it you can order from IRI that talks about the whole project, and as I said, there's a recording of the full presentation I had the honor of giving in 2013 out in San Jose as part of the wrap-up of the project. So some overall conclusions and we'll be done. I really believe inductive scenarios are a very powerful tool for exploring the future and guiding R&D and strategy for companies. The time, you really have to invest a lot of time analyzing the scenarios. Some people shortchange that part. Every time I've done one that turned out to be well received, we engaged a lot of the organization in it. So Ted Farrington did not own the result. And I've had a bad result when I just had a consultant do it and hand it back. So it's a great opportunity, and much of it's very workshop friendly. And if you do a really good job, the resulting scenarios are very valuable because you can interrogate them from different directions. You know, what's the future of packaging across different scenarios, things like that. So those are some overall conclusions. These are all the different organizations involved in that project. It was a big undertaking. Strategy Studio in Manhattan made the videos. Christian's my partner at Calypso, who's really, really good at inductive scenarios, and there are just a few who are really skilled at it. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm wrapping up, and if there are any questions out there, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
All right, thank you so much, Ted. We do have a couple of questions. Let me pull up the attendees list so I can get you. I think Sean Wells, do you want to ask your question? Hold on one second. Let me find you to unmute you. There's that. Okay, hold on. Coming to Sean. All right, and go for it.
Hello?
Sean, do you want to ask your question or just want me to read it?
I can ask it.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess my question is, there's a large prediction that the U.S. is moving to a different part of the value chain and becoming a services economy. The presentation talks a lot about technological advancements to improve human efficiency. What are your thoughts on innovation in the services industry? Do you see it more in technological augmentation, or do you actually see innovation in the services themselves? Do you see us really trying to innovate the way we provide services, the types of services we provide? How have you seen this process applied to services as opposed to, I guess, maybe the technology to deliver services?
That's a great question, and could take a long time to discuss. But I have seen some interesting things. I mean, many companies are making that transformation. I mean, IBM is known as one of the few completely able to reinvent itself from a seller of large computers to services. I've seen companies, they change their business model. If you buy a jet engine from Rolls-Royce, they basically sell jet engine as a service. You don't buy that. You buy 10 years of thrust that they treat more as a service they're providing you, a capability that they're providing you. So even people manufacturing hardware are changing the model by which they look at their businesses. The trend you're talking about, I think, has been going on for a while. With the trade issues we're watching right now, there's a large point of view that the manufacturing part's less than half of our trade anymore. So services have already come to dominate. I think one area we see a lot of work is using big data to understand what the consumers and customers want much better than we ever could before. And then that leading to services. So I think the technology to identify services is a big area, and healthcare is becoming that. Pretty soon you'll have remote healthcare. You may get AI just doing your own diagnosis, so it'll move to more of an individual service than I got to go to the doctor and do something. So that's just a few thoughts off the top of my head, but there's a lot going on in that. Every time you go into a company that's a traditional manufacturer, we're not comfortable with doing this, but maybe we should switch to more of a services model. Comes up. So great question. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Let's see here. Looks like this is all in the chat box. I'm checking for hands now. Andrew Kessler, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. Andrew, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to know if you had any recommendations for any of us who want to get more experience or more education.
Sure. The question is recommendations for getting more experience or education in this. There are schools who give degrees in strategic foresight. There's a Futures Institute at the University of Houston. It does a master's degree. They also do like executive short courses where you get to use the tools and become familiar with it. University of Hawaii does, and I think a couple universities in England. I mean, I'm not a trained futurist or scenario builder. I had a problem when I was working at PepsiCo. We started 2 long-range research groups, and the basic problem was PepsiCo does great at understanding what its consumers want for the next couple of years, but how do you launch a 5-10-year breakthrough initiative when you only have a 2-year horizon? And that, luckily through word of mouth, found Christian Cruz, who's educated. He has an undergraduate degree in I think literature, but then in graduate school went to Houston. So there's formal degrees in it, and they help. That I was never trained as much as just kind of learned by assimilation, I guess. If there are people who've trained and they have a lot more tools than I've talked about, there are some books. I think both of these talks have a list of a few books at the end. Yeah, I mean, there it is. There are some books you can get a hold of. Like I said, these shell scenarios are published every year. There's actually a society. Yeah, there's a let's see, Society of Association of Professional Futurists, I think it is. there's a whole ecosystem of these folks, and you'll find some in your area. When we did the IRI project, we hosted big workshops in Washington D.C. and 4 local futurists came to help us guide them. And if there's a site by Lisa Bodell, I believe it is, and I'll track it down later, but she has a whole teaching part to her consultancy. And if someone will remind me of that, I'll make sure I find it when I'm done. Okay.
All right, let me see if I have any more questions here. I don't see any in the chat. And that is it. If I missed you, just ping me real quick. But other than that, I think we are good. So thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. I hope you found that informative. We will make the slides available and hopefully the recording after the session. So stay tuned for that. And keep your eye out for future events and future webinars through the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Institute and through our Innovation Masters program. Thanks a lot and have a great day.
And thank you all for the opportunity. Bye-bye.